everyone. For the sake of the camera, this is the San Francisco MySQL meetup group. For those in the room, hopefully you already knew that. If not, you're in for a surprise. Tonight we have Jerry from SkySQL. He's going to talk to us about MaxScale. So we'll be doing that in just a few minutes. Our sponsors tonight, Protona, paid for the food and stuff. Big thanks to them. They're always hiring or always doing cool things. They'll be raffling off some tickets to Protona Live. So that's a conference coming up in April. So hopefully you all get a chance to go to that. Other sponsors tonight, Mastery, they sponsor my time. They sponsor some of the beverages, some of the camera equipment, all that kind of fun stuff. We have Lithium, they're sponsoring the place, they're sponsoring the beer, a lot of the coordination stuff, so big thanks to them. Also sponsor Darren's time. Just because I always give them a shout out, O'Reilly is also kind of an unofficial sponsor, though we've run out of books, so I'm going to order some more of those to raffle off. Upcoming events that might be interesting, there's Protona Live I mentioned in April. March 5th, the San Francisco PHP meetup group is having Sarah Goldman talk about Hip Hop Virtual Machine. That's at sfphp.org. That should be pretty interesting. It's basically the way Facebook takes PHP code, compiles it down into C, and runs that. It's really neat stuff. Do we have our next event scheduled for this? We have Ryan from Protona talking next month. I don't know the date. Well,
no, we haven't.
We haven't set a date yet. We will announce that shortly. Am I missing?
And more raffle prizes March before the Protona.
Yeah. So there will be more raffle prizes next month as well. As we do always, anyone looking to be hired? Awesome.
We're back in the bubble.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody wants to mention their hiring. 5-second blurb. Once, twice, done. Anybody got any announcements about any other community events or something related to technology that they want to announce? All right. So with that, we'll kick it over to Jerry and go from there.
My name is Gerardo Narvaja, but my mom wanted to call me Jerry, and they wouldn't allow her in Argentina. So when I moved to the U.S. a few years back, it came in really handy that that was the nickname that she wanted to give me, the real name that she wanted to give me. So don't feel guilty of not being able to pronounce my name and just calling me Jerry. I joined MySQL back in the days when 3.23 was just out the door. If some of you remember those days. And I've been with MySQL through the Sun acquisition. After that, I became a DBA, MySQL DBA, and I worked at Python and a couple of other organizations. And then since that didn't mean any travel and meeting with interesting people and interesting companies, I joined Tokutech, and I've been at this meetup last year speaking about TokuMX, if I remember correctly. And then I joined last November SkySQL as an SE, and basically working with Louis, who's here, which I worked with when I was at MySQL on the same role. And we're visiting the same companies, the same faces, just a few years later. And it's really interesting what people are still doing with MySQL and how much innovation is coming. If you follow the announcements, SkySQL has been announcing, very busy actually, both from the MariaDB side and the SkySQL property side, a number of things since a few months back. One of them not only has to do with the investment that we got to grow the organization and the merger with the multi-program organization, but also a couple of products. One of them is MaxScale that we're going to talk about today. The other one is MariaDB Manager, and MariaDB 10.0, which is no longer just a patch. MySQL is now a full fork of MySQL for a number of reasons. Probably motive for another meetup after the Protona Live when it's going to be GA. But today I'm going to talk about MaxScale, since it is really where the highest innovation today is, and it's one of the very interesting products that has been missing for quite a while. So what is MaxScale? it is, here has some definitions, but it's more than this. I call it the next generation proxy for databases. And although today it works, integrated with MySQL or MariaDB, it has the potential to work with any other storage or backend storage or storage system. Right now, with the features that it has been released, it is a sophisticated query routing layer, and we're going to go through some of the use cases. It allows to facilitate availability. Basically, since it sits between the application and the database layer, it is capable of rerouting queries based on a number of criteria, and that simplifies availability. You might have a master with multiple slaves, for example, which is very common configuration these days, and it will be able to distinguish which transactions go to the master and which queries should be rerouted to the slaves. In the case of scaling, instead of having a master and a slave, you might have a Galera cluster, 3, 4, 5 nodes, and in that case is also able to recognize as new nodes go offline, or nodes go offline and new nodes come online, or nodes recover from a failure, and it will scale automatically, and the application wouldn't know any better, which is usually what developers want, and especially people in operations, because it means that you tell them, okay, this is a port, these are your credentials, and go crazy, and you guarantee in the back end that everything is highly available, or all continuously available, and it balances out, and you can handle growth. It has an authentication layer of its own, so that reduces the number of trips that sessions have to go to the database and back when you have connection pooling, or the connection pooling mechanisms, or some drivers that need to go back and forth to verify credentials. And it has multiple protocol support, or the potential to have multiple protocol support. And as I was saying, that goes both to connect to the backend storage or on the client side as well. So you can communicate, for example, using JSON. Currently, it's open source. It's fully open source, and it's currently it's an alpha state. And one of the things that we're doing is listening to people like you, to what ideas, what kind of use cases they think this fits in, and if we see enough traction in one feature over another, give that a priority, and even allow you to, or invite you to participate in the development, and we'll see how that works. It supports both MySQL and MariaDB 5.5 and later. It does support Galera cluster, in addition to regular replication. Not even that, you could replace traditional master-slave configuration on the back end with a Galera cluster, and the application wouldn't know any better. And MaxScale has the potential to rebalance and reroute all the queries accordingly. So it's a very convenient way to be independent of the back end for the application. And it also supports MHA. It's actually completely transparent to MHA. So I'm not sure whether you're familiar with it, but it's a mechanism to semi-automatically promote slaves and promote the best slave to become a master on a regular master-slave installation. And MaxScale will see how it works to recognize that automatically. And in the same way that MHA works, there are other tools out there. I think there is one from Percona that does something similar, and there is at least one set of scripts from the MySQL utilities that does something similar. It is compatible with those. So basically, we'll detect that a master got promoted or demoted. Nice, technical. Here we go. Come on. You there? So,
I don't think it was
that. I think it's.
Is it K-Trip?
Maybe that your screen resolution is too low.
Well, we adjusted it and it was working just fine.
This looks like some kind of connection.
There we go. There we go. There we go. That's a nice sound effect for what's going on.
Got it. Perfect.
Okay. Okay, hold on.
See, they come in handy, huh?
By availability.
It's working.
Yeah.
So I think it's something with the projector because I'm definitely getting signal still on the stream.
Violins.
And where's the presentation? Might be the projector then.
Yeah, where's that remote? Let me see that.
Yeah, but now actually the thing is still.
Well, you got a big screen here, right?
So do we hit up Brian?
Yeah, we're having to have Brian here. I don't know what's.
So I'll keep going, and you don't have to use your imagination, because I don't even have the presentation on the screen, so maybe I should do that too.
Yeah, so it's, the screen's coming through on the computer. Ah, there we go. That's what I'd like to see. Something anyway.
But, okay, I don't have the two displays. So the session that had the presentation is done as well.
There we go. Are you blinking still? Driver's side.
Sure.
I put it 1200 by.
Yeah, but it is like that. Comes and goes. You do the mirror. Yeah, that seems to. No, that's.
Maybe it's not like my adapter on the other side. So I will, we'll switch you over to just straight out instead of the dual
Yeah.
capture and see what happens with that. Sorry. Do you have a center? Because the HDMI cable's fairly short.
Extender?
Well, to get this all the way up to the front, will this reach all the way up to where we've got?
Yeah, it should actually.
Sorry, everyone.
It's always you. You're.
It's my car.
You might have to bring that little table.
Yeah.
Apologies for the people online.
Good.
Yay.
Here we go. Okay, this is where we were. So MaxScale, really the product, it's the core. And the core is, it uses a messaging protocol, and it's event driven. And around the core, we implement a number of modules. The authentication module, we already have one in place, and that can be replaced. And it has the capabilities of removing, you can load and unload modules without having to reboot the system, and you can reload configuration and etc. So you can add a protocol when the system is live. And for example, right now it supports only MySQL protocols, but you could potentially be both on the routing, monitoring, and protocol. You can be communicating to applications that expect to communicate with MongoDB, for example, or some other database systems, and the router, which is the one that sends the queries from the application out to the backends. It could also, right now it's only MySQL, but you can write routers to communicate it to other types of storages, for example, Cassandra or Hadoop or document stores. So let's say that you want to do some auditing with MaxScale. You could be receiving all the requests coming from the clients as MySQL applications, and then you will have a router that talks to the MySQL servers, and it registers the replies and then brings them back to the client. But at the same time, you could have, with the help of a filtering and logging module, another store, which is MongoDB, and basically every single request that comes in through the client side also being stored on a document store to do further analysis and reports later. The monitors monitor the database data, and this is important on the load balancers and rerouting that we're going to see in a moment. And what it does is it monitors the status of the different databases, for example, identifying whether it's a master or a slave, if it is a Galera node, whether it's up, down, or it is taking out of service, for example, when you're doing a data synchronization. And then act upon the results that the monitor is bringing out. Authentication work the way it is implemented right now is when you fire up MaxScale, it reads the authentication tables from the server on the back end, and then it uses that information to authenticate users coming in. And users can be mapped. So you can have a user by first name on connecting to MaxScale or application users, but you can have a single user connecting to the back end of the database. In order to monitor and do a bunch of other maintenance tasks, MaxScale needs its own user to the back end as well. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to monitor, and it doesn't need all the privileges that a regular database user will need. So the first example, and this is some of the things that it can do today, even though it's an alpha, is doing read-write splits. And the way it will do it is you might have two connections to the server, one for the writes, another one for the reads. And everything that comes, and the writes would include maybe some immediate reads. For example, the application needs to read some statuses or some information in order to process a transaction from the server. All of that will go through the read channel. And MaxScale, what it would do is identify through the monitoring service which ones are slaves, which one is the master, and make sure that the status of all the slaves is stable, and write everything that comes through the connection that does the writes goes straight to the master, and everything, all the transit, for example, reporting or displaying some information to populate screens that comes through the read-only channel, it is rerouted to the slaves. But it also will be monitoring the slaves, and it will be monitoring how far behind a replication are. And it will flag if one of the slaves, for whatever reason, for example, is taking a backup or is writing a heavy report or a heavy query from some other previous session, and a replication falls behind for any reason, MaxScale is intelligent enough to know that that node is not usable, and it will send a request to any of the other slaves instead.
What does it do when all the slaves fall behind?
Then it will reroute it to the master. But you can write your own rules, and we'll talk a little bit more as we go further. So this is basically what I just mentioned. There is an overhead for doing all that load balancing and intelligence in the middle, but it's minimum, and what you gain is, since you're able to scale out a lot easier, what you gain in flexibility more than makes up for whatever latency you might have by using MaxScale in the middle. If the master fails and one of the slaves gets promoted, MaxScale will detect it, of course, as with any other failover mechanism, any pending transaction will be lost. But as soon as one of the other slaves gets promoted as being master, and that is done by an external mechanism, could it be manual, could it be MHA, could be one of the other mechanisms that exist to do that, it will detect that there is a new master in the configuration, and it will take that master, recognize it, and then it will reroute automatically traffic to that master. In the same way, if you then, as many people do, bring that master back online and put it as a slave to the new master, it will then detect that there is a new slave in town, and as soon as it caught up and it's up to date, it will put it back into the rotation for the load balancing. Sure.
In a master failure scenario, is MaxScale smart enough to know if you're in the middle of a transaction, or like might begin, do a couple of inserts, master fails, something else gets promoted? How does MaxScale?
MaxScale is transparent. It's not that intelligent in this version or with these modules. So if a connection is lost, basically as you would, on a regular transaction to the master, it will return an error to the client. In this case, it will return the error to MaxScale and the connection, and that will, bubble up to the application. So the application will have to react to whatever condition as it would do if it connects to the master directly.
Can your clients pin to a particular master? Like say you're interacting with one, you don't want to get bounced off to another one because your rights have been replicated over. You say, keep me on this copy of the master.
Potentially. So the question is if you can pin certain activity to one of the servers, because this applies to the slaves. You might want the slaves, certain.
It's like a master, and in that case, say you're written to this one master, you want your next read to go.
Yeah, you can do, potentially you can do that. We don't have it done for this, and that comes up, and I'm not sure if I have the slide, but that comes up later on. You could have remember this, actually we have MariaDB 10.0, and 10.0 has multi-source replication. So what you could do is you could have, instead of a master, you could have a Galera cluster, a 3-node Galera cluster. And you could still replicate from that cluster to a chain of slaves. And each one of the slaves will have all 3 nodes as masters of themselves. And because of the GTAD, it would know which transactions have already been applied on it. In that case, it will be balancing the writes to any of the 3 nodes that are masters and all the reads to the rest of the slaves. And as they change roles for whatever reason, it will recognize that. But the idea is, or it's in the plans, to be able to pin certain loads, and we would tag some way those queries to go to a certain server. So for example, in this case, we're saying any read-only load will come from any of the slaves, but you could say, of all these slaves, most of them will do regular read-only loads, but the heavy reporting or ETL process or the backups would only be taken from one specific slave, which, for example, could have a higher tolerance to fall behind.
Good question I have. The MHA you mentioned, some MHA configurations can run, you can have 2 masters and multiple slaves for MHA, right?
Yeah.
But because this one is sensing which one is master, would it get confused because I have 2?
No, it will detect. You can specify, 2 masters, and then if you have the 2 masters as writable, does MHA allow this, or does it require, even though it's master-master, it requires one of the masters to be read-only?
Yes, it does. If you have to set it to yes, it does.
Okay, so it would detect that the slave that is a read-only server, and then it wouldn't route any transactions to that. Yeah, I didn't remember from MHA that requirement, but. In this case, it's a Galera cluster, and basically each server will have a single connection to MaxScale as it would connect to any MySQL server. MaxScale will be monitoring the state of the nodes. It would know that these are Galera nodes, and basically it will reroute traffic to any of the nodes, and it will be intelligent to know monitoring the status variables from the Galera cluster, which node is able to be receiving transactions or not. So if one of the nodes goes offline, comes back online, and you have one of the other nodes serving the data for synchronization, for example, it would know that it would have to relay all the traffic to the remaining node, which is fully active, instead of dealing with or loading the one that is serving the synchronization or the one that is actually catching up. If you add, in this case, if you add a 4th node, it will automatically detect it, and as soon as it's caught up after the full synchronization or the IST synchronization, it will put it into the rotation and recognize it. There's nothing that needs to be done on MaxScale configuration-wise or on the client side.
So when using MaxScale with Galera, I'm forced to have multiple writers, or can I say I want this Galera cluster with a single writer?
That's a good question. I believe that it will recognize that from the status of the node, because when you declare it, you basically are in the configuration of Galera, you have to tell which one is the writer, right?
Well, you can have multiple writers.
Yeah, but if you say, oh, I only want this one to be the writer, and the other one's not, there's a status variable that actually tells it.
So it'll happen. I'm not forced to then use all master capabilities.
Yeah, so, but I'll have to confirm that.
I have a quick question then. So the way, is it detecting the database's availability by a similar way like a 5 does? Like for example, you have some kind of table and the value inside the table. Is it doing the same thing? By checking the value within the table and saying, okay, this is available, this is not available. Well, F5 works in the same principle, the load balancer. Is that how it works?
As far as I know, the current module, it only checks the status of the Galera variables to know which one is available or not. Eventually, the plan is that you can say certain tables will be written, certain traffic will go to, certain tables for one of the nodes, certain other tables for one of the other nodes. So if you have a cluster that is, in different data centers, all the traffic that comes from the tables that correspond to the local servers, it will be redirected to that server instead of the one that is on the next data center. So that is planned, is one of the things that is on the works. But right now, it just checks the status variables, which one is available, which one is offline, and which one is doing some other task. And I don't remember the names of the variables off the top of my head. So this is read-write splitting, but with a single connection instead of two connections. And it basically identifies which ones are DML statements, and the DML statements are always redirected to the master. All the reads are identified on or loaded or sent to the slaves. We talked about this. So what I will do, how are we in time?
It is 7:34.
7:34, and we
Yeah,
have
hour.
until 8.
And then we do the raffle, but you can.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to go all the way to 8:30. Well, with questions, yes, of course. So let's look at the configuration and installation. Right now, we provide a URL. Of course, all of this is on GitHub, and I'll have the URLs for GitHub in one of the last slides. Binaries are pre-compiled. They're not easy to find on the website. We'll have the URL as well at this point. It is a preview installation. The example shows how to actually uncompress. In this case, it goes under user local SkySQL. My own preference is under OPT. Different conventions, different configurations. However, we'll see it's really easy to modify. These are the directories as they're expanded. Documentation is very complete, so if you want a full picture on what we're going to see in the next few slides, please go on the documentation and check it out. There's also some sample configurations as well. Everything is GPL v2. Executing with -H as expected. It shows all the command line options. They're very simple. One is help, and the other two are three. The other options are only three options. Whether to run it as a terminal process. When I'm debugging, I like to launch these kind of processes on a screen. That way it can work interactively. You can see everything going to standard out messages. And with screen, it works sort of as a service, although you have the overhead of screen, but screen is very lightweight. Define the home directory, which is the equivalent to MySQL base there, and the absolute path name to the configuration file. It would expect it under etc to begin with, or the default is MaxScale home, whatever it's defined as the home directory, and under this etc subdirectory. But you can specify the absolute path to the configuration file if you want to put it somewhere else. Since it's alpha, putting everything under the home directory might be the cleanest way, because then you just wipe out that directory and everything is gone. Otherwise, you'll have to start tracking it down for where it landed during your installation. MaxScale home would be the home directory. You can, for this to work, actually you have to put export. But if you put it on a script, there's no need for export if you don't want to persist that variable. All the libraries, since it's a tarball, not a package, end up under the same tree. So you need to add the path for the dynamically linked libraries. Where are they going to be loaded from? And basically then you just run it. This is the output. As I was saying, if you run it from inside a script and maybe as a startup script, you won't see this output, and that's why one of the reasons I run it inside a screen. So you would have to add the additional option on MaxScale and then just exit or detach the screen. And then you can tail those files as needed. It uses for client connections port 4004 that can be configured, of course, to be the same port as MySQL. And then it allows HTTP connections for a REST API to interact with MaxScale directly. That part hasn't been implemented yet, it's under works. And it allows also telnet connections. And telnet connections are a great way to monitor what's going on inside MaxScale. So it's very easy, telnet to localhost to port 4444, which was the port that we saw in that message. By default, the login is admin with password SkySQL. And then if you type help, it will give you all the available commands, you know, like how many database users, what are the modules and the monitors that are loaded, or what kind of servers. You can restart the monitors, you can restart some of the service, and you have to specify the name of the service. We're going to go through that in a moment. Add user, remove user is mostly for MaxScale, not for the backend databases. And you can even shut down the services. You can shut down one of the monitors. Okay.
They're doing construction upstairs.
Someone fell down the
No,
stairs.
I'm serious, they are.
Someone fell down the ladder. Hopefully they're okay. You can barely see it at the bottom, but you have the reload commands. As I was saying, you can add a new service, you can add a new server, you can add a new module, and so let's say you compile a new module or a new protocol, you can reload the modules, and that's right there on the black band, and or reload the configuration if you reset everything. And you don't have to restart anything. So the application, you know, will have a blip, but basically everything will still keep running. Yeah.
Why are you setting a default password and not having telnet disabled unless somebody explicitly sets a password?
Well, this is alpha, and this is the best way to debug what's going on in the status, what it is.
Okay.
We're going to see that actually the configuration files also have passwords in the clear, which if you're in the MySQL realm, you're kind of used to it. But so if you put the right permissions and everything, it
Package
will
has a default password gets out.
yeah, and the other thing, and this is actually password to MaxScale. So if MaxScale, the server running MaxScale doesn't have access to the internet, if you wish. And this is only through localhost. So if you close your access, you know, someone will have to SSH, then, you know, there is some, I agree with you, but being alpha, it's easier to have the debugging interfaces up and out than having to make it, you know, in the configuration. This all will change as it is released. As I was saying, by default, all the passwords are in the clear. You know, the passwords to connect to the backend servers are in the clear. But there is a mechanism similar to MySQL 5.6 to support encrypted passwords. So in that case, there's a mechanism by which you define the password. You only specify the hash. I'm not sure I have that slide, but it is described in the documentation, and it's a somewhat involved process.
Is this the interface we use if we want to get like a list of what are the currently executing queries and where are they being pointed and how long have they been executing? Is this the interface, or is there a separate API?
That is separate. That's one of the use cases that we're looking into with the logging module. That's the only one that we don't have an example module right now. But that's one of the things, is monitor the queries that are running and being able, for example, to kill them or take actions. But then there's many ways in MySQL to do that anyway. So.
Top, but what if you're connecting to a different database? So there's not an top for MongoDB, and you want it all together.
Well, you could, yeah. Again, we don't have the modules to do the logging, but you could do that. As a matter of fact, one of the projects that is also in the roadmap and it's being worked on is the fact that you can have all those slaves as I was showing, and define one of the slaves such that all the queries when they're long running, for example, get and log the explain for it. But the explain wouldn't be executed on the same server as where the query is executed, because explains can load the server as well. So you would have one server, one of the slaves defined as the one from where the explains come from. And so the system, what it would do is it would receive the request, execute the query, so it would have no overload or no additional load tied to that server. But if that server qualifies to grab an explain plan, that explain plan would not be done from the same servers where the load are coming. It will be a special server that is spun by just to run explains. But it has the same data as the rest of the slaves.
And that's a feature, or that's on the road?
That's a planned feature. And again, all of this is open source, so you can have you can write your own, and it's all in C language. So what it uses, MaxScale, the core uses EPOL for messaging, and EPOL is a service, a very lightweight messaging service within Linux. So that's one of the reasons it only runs on Linux and it doesn't run on Windows or some of the other platforms. You can have MaxScale running on the same servers as the application servers, for example. So you basically load the same MaxScale with the same exact configuration on each one of your application servers, and then if one comes down, everything comes down, and the other ones would still be, load balancing. You can have HA running on their own services, and you can have something like HA Linux or something like that, where if one of the MaxScale instances comes down, the other one will be routing the traffic, or you can have it running on the master, things like that. But the idea is that you don't have a single point of failure, and if your web application or your client application is down, basically if MaxScale is down with it, that's something tolerable. This is a configuration file, and it can be confusing, but once you figure out how it works, it's pretty easy. Each section has its own series of comments, and if I read correctly, the first one refers to the monitor, and when it's in the brackets, the section for the configuration file is the name of the service for that, and in that case is a MariaDB 10 monitor. And then you define that it's a type monitor on the 5-side figure, the pentagon. This corresponds to the blue block that is a monitor. The module name has a relationship with the name of the shared library. In this case, is a MySQL mon. As you write your own, that name will change and expand on the options you offer. What are the server names that you're monitoring? And each one of those corresponds to another section, and we're going to see it in the next slide. Then the password, the username and password to connect to those servers to do the monitoring. This one is the one that I was mentioning. It's out in the clear, but you can specify the hash if you go through the work of configuring encrypted passwords. In this case, then we define the service. In this case, it's a split router, read-write split router. Same thing, very similar. In this case, you specify what kind of, the type of service instead of monitor, and the router name, the library name. Again, the servers to which one it connects, what are the credentials for this particular server. The HTTP router, as I was saying, is not implemented yet. The debug interface, and if I believe, here's the second part. As I was saying, everything, now you figure out the mechanism here. This is the name of the servers that were listed on the other ones, on the other sections of the configuration file. Each one goes with its own address or hosting. In this case, the type
How
of.
was auto detect?
So-
Am I like missing something? I thought that it would go out.
That's for Galera.
Only for Galera.
Yeah, and basically you specify all the servers, and you could add a new one, for example, for if it is a new slave, you add a new one, you say, okay, here it is. The server may not be up, may be up or not, but
Just because sometimes in the cloud, servers come and go, and it can make it hard if you're bringing out a lot of servers. if
Yeah, you
have to
can-
do this.
yeah, this is the initial configuration, and but as it monitors, in the case of Galera, since each one of the nodes has the IP address of all the nodes in the cluster, once the cluster is properly initialized, it can take the information from there. All of them would have to have the same authentication as we were saying on the previous screen.
Can you reload the configuration without restarting the process?
Yes. There is, on the telnet, at the bottom of the screen, the part that we couldn't see here, that's where the reload mechanisms were. You can say, for example, let's say that you have, so here the servers are, they say it's a type server and the protocol is MySQL backend. So let's say that that is a MongoDB or something like that to store logs. Then you say, oh, I have the new library. You do load the corresponding module as the server is live. You modify the configuration to add a new MongoDB server. You reload the configuration and everything keeps going as it was. Yeah.
Hard-coded IP addresses, can you use those names?
You can use host names as well, and you can change the ports. Here, the service, you have a listener for the router, and here you see the name of the service is actually the name in the section here. So it knows how to tie everything together to make it work.
I have a quick question. You have the thread parameter there. What's that for? Is it number of cores, or you see the very first one, MaxScale?
Yeah. So it depends on how many processes you're running. You can basically you specify the number of threads that although internally it's running several threads. The client thread, how many client threads or how many module threads you might be running as well, and you specify a bigger number of threads.
But how do you make the call? By number of cores that they have, or twice the number of cores they have? Or?
They're still measuring, to tell you the truth. So usually with specifying threads as one, it has been enough for the load, but only when you have a very intense load, then you specify more threads. But it's not clear, measuring the benchmarks to find out exactly when it is convenient, because then you have overthreads, you have overhead for the mutexes and synchronization of threads and everything. But in general, they have the measurement that we have had this far with threads equals 1 has worked, and usually we don't recommend to go a lot further than 4 or even 6. Then again, that depends on how you're running it and what else are you running where you're running MaxScale. Right now, as of what we have measured this far, having a dedicated server for MaxScale might be overkill, unless it's a virtualized server and it's a small instance.
Does it tend to be more RAM heavy or CPU heavy?
No, that's a good question. Since it doesn't cache anything other than the user and everything else is just routing, it doesn't have much of an overhead in terms of RAM. But if you start doing logging and other types of processing, like filtering on the queries of the result sets, you could potentially filter, let's say depending on the user profile, you could easily write rules with proper filtering and logging where you say, okay, these rows or these columns should be obfuscated or something. to implement security, PCI certification, or whatever. And in that case, some of those results will be cached. So it depends on what the module. These modules are very simple, so they're not very RAM heavy. I would guess that as it stands today, it's more processor heavy. Again, since the load that it does is mostly routing, it's not processor heavy at all. We'll be more worried that it has enough capacity or bandwidth to route it, handle all the incoming bandwidth and the outgoing bandwidth.
Yeah.
Since it has to handle all the bandwidth from all the servers. So
Yeah.
the servers might have, you have the result sets of all the slaves going through over all the nodes in case it's delivered. So it's very simple. The different modules, as you combine them, make references to the other modules. You can have multiple services and multiple modules loaded, so it can be handling more than one type of load, or behaving with more than one role as it connects to different services. This is where it is in GitHub. It has the source code and documentation. The documentation, as I said, as you compile it, it will go into a specific directory. It is very complete. Ivan, who was supposed to be here, he's the CTO, Chief Technical Officer of the company, and the Chief Talking Officer. So slightly different roles, same acronyms. So I talk more than being participating with engineers. We have our VP of Engineering present in the room, so he can answer some other questions in terms of what the roadmap might look like in the future. What are we? He mostly wants to listen from you about ideas of what the questions were, because that denotes where the interest is. The configuration guide. That's the URL that I will hand the presentation to Erin either later tonight or tomorrow. Otherwise, Erin will ping me until I do. So I'd rather get it off my hair. Love her. She can be very thorough.
Are you guys going to have an API guide for how to write the modules?
That is something that is being, I believe, this is version 0.4. The next version will be 0.5, still alpha. The version 0.5 will have the API fully defined, right? Yeah, and then the next release will be the first beta, which will be 1.0.
And that's coming?
That's coming around, 1.0 around Percona Live, probably after, right?
It will be after Percona Live,
So the guide will be there by then?
yeah, I mean, the whole point here is to make sure that we've got good documentation on the API, because we really want people to use the examples on it.
And I believe one of the reasons that the logging and filter module wasn't done was because that's one of the points of the API that was still in flux at this point.
On the roadmap, is there the ability to take data and say, well, this goes into the database like this. I want to take this and put it in cache. Take this data, stick it in Redis. Will it be able to route that way?
It could. But as I was saying,
hasn't been done. So
yeah, it hasn't been done.
caching layer.
No, yeah. I think that of all the conversations I've been at, you're the first one to suggest the caching layer. But
Because-
that doesn't mean it's.
Yeah, a lot of young engineers know things should be cached and they just want something else like this to do.
Yeah, but it potentially can do that. If basically at that point, the big challenge here is MaxScale inside it has an embedded MariaDB server, and it does that so it has the full benefit of the parser mainly. So it parses according to the MariaDB 5.5 parser, and eventually we'll have the MariaDB 10 parser. And one of the discussions was, what if, then you have certain limitations, but it doesn't do anything with the parsing other than just parse and pass it on. Say, oh, it's an insert, then it is a write, or it's, so we're looking into tagging the queries. So say, okay, query tag like this, it will go to this group of servers, query tag like that, we'll do it here. So let's say that you want to cache certain queries, then it would say, okay, this is a query that should be cached, and then have something that will tell them whether the cache is, should actually go through Redis and get the cache result set, or should go straight to the database to obtain whatever.
And then there's that pesky thing when you bring a slave up and it's cold and you need to warm it up. So generally I write, crazy stuff that if I have a query, I send it to the slave that's warm and I'm going to get the results back, but I also send a copy to my new slave. Will I be able to do
That's
fancy?
tricky, because you probably could, monitoring the
Say
MariaDB cache and how it is warm or not, but on the other hand, if you don't send load to the slave, how are you going to warm it up?
Yes, you have to send queries there to warm it up.
Well, or you can use the query dump, the cache dump. I mean, that it's on Persona and on MariaDB. Well, I did tests on that, and when I tested it, our servers would take up to 4 hours to warm up when you brought them up. When we started using the buffer dump, I can't remember the name of the variables. Sorry, I'm getting old.
That's okay.
But when we started doing that, they warmed up in 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the load. So you had a question?
I guess expanding on Aaron's question, can I weight a server? Can I say, okay, I've got 5 servers, these 4 each give 24% in the final?
That is something that you would incorporate into the monitoring modules, yes. And we were talking about, different ways. For example, you very well know that seconds behind master is not a reliable variable to determine whether the server is down or not, whether the server is behind or not. It might be misleading because it might show that it is up to date, but then the big transaction comes right after and you're screwed. And the other way around, the big transaction means, okay, it's going to take some time, not what seconds behind master says, but maybe you're measuring bytes behind master too, and then there is a combination. Or you might use a heartbeat. And the heartbeat, then you have to specify in the monitoring module where to read the heartbeat and how to read it, and it might be by table, it might be its own table. There's several ways, because, for example, you might have the highly transactional tables that might fall behind, but all the other tables, the reference tables, I can't remember now the name of those tables, but statistics, the statistic that it's the reference tables, yeah.
I guess my question was more, it's like, say I had the budget to buy one new server, and it's twice as fast as everything else. Can I say give everybody else half as much traffic as this server? Like, do I add multiple entries?
You would have, we don't have the routing module to have all those rules specified, but potentially yes, you could do that.
And then I had another question. I'm really sorry. You mentioned that there's embedded MariaDB just for the parser. So is there an explicit we will maintain compatibility with?
Well, it also handles some internal data, and I'm not sure. I think it uses in memory or caching. So it uses some other functionality.
But do I have to worry that MariaDB 11 and MySQL 7 are going to this won't work with MySQL?
That is under discussion, and there was an internal discussion where they were thinking, okay, what if the parser is another one?
Oh, plug the parser.
And then instead of linking it to MariaDB 5.5 or 10.0, you link it to, libMySQL AB. That brings up a whole kind of worms because of the licensing, though. MariaDB and MariaDB is all GPL, and the client libraries are LGPL. If you're going to have to put in there something that is MySQL, then you're embedding something that Oracle will try to get royalties on.
And that's a question I have exactly, because if I contribute, let's say, to this development, what kind of license is it?
The core is GPL v2, and all the modules are GPL v2. However, since we have a clearly defined plug-and-play API, it's not like the storage engine API where you have to compile everything, and that creates coupling. The modules are completely decoupled. If you define a module that is rule breaker, completely exceptional, and you want to do it commercial, go ahead, you can do it. The way the API is defined is such that there is no coupling between your code for the module and the rest of the system. And right?
Yeah, no, it wouldn't be declared derivative work under DBL2. I mean, that's why we're doing this. I mean, the whole view is to engage the community and, you know, provide the opportunity.
It definitely sounds very interesting. My biggest worry was like, Oracle did the same thing. It was open source, now we need the thread pooling. Became
Well, that's one of the reasons why we're around.
You know, if you guys keep it that way, it's a very good idea because you can continue. You don't want to. So you don't want to close it up down the road and say, hey, this is only going to be an enterprise feature after we, you know.
Exactly.
It looks like very promising.
I mean, it's you know, we're not going after, you know, the whole strategy of looking like an open source company and then trying to get everyone to buy licenses. That's, you know, what we are sort of actually pushing.
That's why we this was multi-program, and then SkySQL did all the LGPL libraries. It's because of that.
You can bet, and I spent 2 days in interesting discussions with Monty last week, and you can bet that is a strong principle of, you know, really continuing real community-based open source development around MariaDB and all of the associated pieces of it.
That's a good idea. It looks very promising.
So I have another question.
Okay, he was first. Sorry.
I was actually also related to what I was saying as a sidebar. As the young person in the room, caching is definitely like an elephant in the room for so many reasons, including like doing multi-data center deployments and things like that. So there's a real use for that us young people are looking at. My question was, if anybody's using this in production right now,
No, we just launched it, and we're doing. Ivan is doing the world tour. He couldn't be here because he got called last minute to meeting of engineers from another project where we.
It's 0.4 alpha. You know, we're not going to advise people to put this into production at this point.
is the beta it's starting to work in state
Data will
production?
data will really be the point.
Each organization has its own rules, but we're presenting this for really big projects and production for big companies, big names. Obviously we can't reveal, but we're putting it to the test on POCs, several POCs that potentially have the goal is to go to production before the end of the year. So that is the status. We're recommending, you want to do a POC, see how it all fits together, along with MariaDB 10 and some other, MariaDB Manager, which actually all three of them make a really good package, a really good overall solution. You can pick and choose which one you want. But we're doing some interesting POCs, but that is to the extent I would recommend it right now.
The real interest I'm thinking is for smaller organizations that don't have the development staff to go and figure out how to do failover in the application, how to handle all the error codes, how to handle all the different possible failure states. It's really good for doing a good high availability setup. It's stable enough to do so.
Correct. And I didn't talk about MariaDB Manager because it is a presentation of its own. But MariaDB Manager facilitates the provisioning of multiple nodes. So a small organization that you're saying, it could have MaxScale sitting between the application servers and the 3 or 4 servers that they might have in the back end. But as they scale out, they need, or they decide to go with a more reliable chase solution, then they have to rip it off, put it into their Galera. Well, it's not ripping off, there's path. But all of that can be done transparently, and they can adopt the new solution as they're ready to, or they have the experience to. MariaDB Manager allows to do that with point-and-click GUI or a REST API, because the GUI is decoupled from the actual server that provides the services. So if you're a big organization with hundreds of servers, you can use it using the REST API and scripting all the interactions with your Puppet or Chef configurations. And we're looking into doing further integration with those kind of tools as well. But you can use the GUI for a small organization and say, hey, now I need more traffic. Maybe I can put a 4th node in my Galera cluster. And then you would point and click, 4th node would go in. And if you have MaxScale sitting between those nodes and the application, everything will just happen automatically. It's very well-defined process in the middle, but it can take me another meetup to explain that.
Sometimes
Eventually, Darren will be playing.
Sometimes the first step is ripping off that first painful band-aid of They've got a single MySQL server. If you wanted to move to a beefier server, that's application downtime. So being able to toss something like this in the mix to say, okay, this is going to take traffic on, and then you can flip over to the server transparently. You don't have to take application downtime. You can do this in the middle of the day,
Well,
you can do it at 2:30 in the morning. You know, you have.
Yeah, one of the things I insisted on the organizations I was at DBA is every time you set up replication, set it up master. It costs absolutely nothing. And then your downtime in the application, if everything is manual and you don't have anything in between, is, okay, now stop the application, point it to the other server, bring it up, and then you do, you know, all the maintenance on the remaining server, and then you put it back into the rotation. That's the minimum I pushed in many organizations, and very successfully as they had more resources. Now, if you put MaxScale in the middle, you can do that without even, you know, well, you have to stop the traffic in the application because the transactions will be lost. But and then you say, oh, I want another slave. Then you grab your backup from last night, put it into the new slave, you know, set up the coordinates properly, and once it starts replicating, you say, okay, there's a new slave, here it is, and all of a sudden everything balances better. So it does provide that level of transparency to the small organization, although it obviously has benefits for the bigger ones as well.
Yeah, it's just tricky when you're a contractor, you go to a new organization, the first thing you're going to do is rip off a really painful Band-Aid, and that's bad precedent. And that's something you always have to work around. So
yeah, and again, since you use MHA, you have the capability of doing those promotions. You can do the rolling updates of the schema as well, which are really painful as well for a small organization.
Yeah, which again, it's, you know, these are the little things you get that first Band-Aid off.
Yeah.
So another question I've been hearing a lot, especially at the Perconas, people are using MySQL with handler socket or the mem cache. They're just trying to get around the optimizer. They're using it as a NoSQL database. So are you going to provide
well,
this
MariaDB has a lot of that in the sense that, first of all, it has the Cassandra engine. I don't know, MariaDB 10 especially has even more. Second of all, it has the Connect engine. The Connect engine provides even more access to all kinds of backends and formats, some natively, some through ODBC. And there's a lot of integration being talked about, and we might actually do other engines as well. A few names were tossed around.
We have to involve other engines, but also are looking at, you know, putting JSON, BSON.
Hadoop.
So I keep hearing Maria, but many people, you know, will work at places where, you know, the powers that be dictate MySQL community. So will you be able to, and MySQL community has handler socket and the memcache storage. So
MariaDB also has handlers.
Yeah.
And it has.
I mean, I'm hearing you fully support Maria, but are you fully?
We do support MySQL as well, but we cannot do any development on MySQL.
Yes, yeah, I know.
And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the decisions that historically has been different. One of the reasons MariaDB is 10.0 and not 5.6. Because we had to fork it at that point if we wanted to put the features that we needed to.
Yeah.
How that's going to play out in the future depends on how the community works. But, that's our way of. So, exclusive offer for the SFO meetup members. And I'm sure Erin will send out an email later this week. There's a training performance tuning class coming up in March. And if you're registered today with Louis is in the back there, we'll give you a 2-for-1. So you sign up one, and you'll get 2 people to get to the class here in San Francisco. This is the description of the class. It's a summary of what you'll find on our website. The target audience is people who already have some experience. It says MySQL, but it does cover MariaDB as well. As you know, the optimizers are different. I don't know if you were aware, but multi-program got all the original MySQL optimizer team went to multi-program and now are part of the SkySQL engineering team. A lot of the work that is being done on the original MySQL is rewriting the optimizer, which Oracle has great engineers, I'm sure, but our guys are the ones who have been working with MySQL optimizer since day one. So this is 2-for-1. Sign up with Louis. He'll explain what the process will be if you want to take part of this promotion. This is extended not only to you guys that are here, but anyone who's in the San Francisco area and is registered with a meetup. My Twitter handle is Seattle Gaucho. You may know me from podcasts like the MySQL Community Podcast that I do with Sherry. I don't know how many of you listen to it. I know Aaron does. So, and these are all the URLs where you can find SkySQL. And one of the things is you may wonder is why MaxScale has a new brand. It's not SkySQL MaxScale or MariaDB MaxScale. And the reason is MaxScale has the potential to work with a completely different environment. Eventually, if we implement ODBC, for example, or a C# connector, it could be working against SQL Server backends, and it's perfectly possible that it would do that. In that case, there's no MariaDB, no MySQL anywhere in the place. It also has the potential to do query translations, so it will bring in the filter and logging modules and combine with all the other modules. It will bring in MySQL syntax in, do the transformation, massage it a little bit, and output and connect to SQL Server, or the other way around. It could have a SQL Server protocol or parser on the front end, and then do all the massaging and connect to MySQL backend or something else. So, and as we said, the protocols can be supporting document stores or some other kind of storage, caching, Redis, Memcached, and etc. To handle it. So, any more questions? Any last questions? Go ahead.
I have last question. So you said when this MaxScale starts up, right, it initializes the user IDs from the databases, right? Will reload command do the same thing?
You mean as you define a new user, it will reload? Not in this version, none of this. Yeah, that has been brought up a couple of times.
Okay.
We're looking into it as well.
Very promising. I really like it.
Yeah, it's one of the technologies. So one of the things that is clear is, Oracle is not the only one putting money into the community or in terms of R&D and product development.
So this is not a derivative of what used to be product, MySQL proxy. It's completely new, right?
No, MySQL proxy. What's his name?
I forgot.
Jan Meschke is the person who wrote it. Was a nice exercise. The story is when we were at MySQL is that he wrote Likey, the Light HTTPD, as an exercise in client server architectures. So, and he said, okay, what is the easiest thing I can write? And selected, HTTP server. Once he was done with that, which took a whole life of his own because that was basically a pet project, it was the prelude to write MySQL proxy, and he wrote it. The problem with MySQL proxy is there was no money behind it for anyone involved in the process, and that was by the time of the Sun acquisition, so the efforts all dispersed, and the product never went out of the alpha state. And even today, although it is used in a number of, it was used as part of MySQL Enterprise Manager, it would still be in alpha state, although it was an integral part of the Enterprise Manager, which it isn't. And everything was a Lua, so it had a bigger overhead than this one.
Very impressive.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be here a week. Keep your waitresses.